So
you and then you.
The conference is original, so figuring out based on the original intent of the Constitution, therefore getting these cases right. This is what the public mainly cares about the case if the result seems fair, it's just. How do you think more conservative judicial philosophers and conservative judges kind of reconcile the two and show people that that was more to get it right than what on the face of it seems fair, even if it's incredibly wrong?
Well, if it's really incredibly wrong, I'm not sure I would quite go along with that. But in this respect, I'm not a pure originalist, I would say. And look, ultimately, presumably, we think that getting the cases right contributes overall to a system that is more just. So I think that's the argument that has to be made. And again, I think there's a little more appreciation of that than there might have been, certainly than there was 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, look at Sotomayor's hearing. I mean, she had to basically back off of her, let's just be fair and nice to people, speeches and statements at various law symposia, whatever, and had to at least profess and pretend that no, she understood the job of the judge is just to get the case right. So I think there's been some progress made in that. I do think it's important to make the argument. It's not enough to say this is what, we have a very long and complicated debate about exactly what the founders or which founders meant by certain provision or whether the 14th Amendment, changed it or not. But one does have to ultimately, as a matter of political persuasion, in terms of the public, link that into a broader understanding of why this whole system is better for liberty and for prosperity and for the future for our children and grandchildren than an alternative system where judges are just calling it as they may. And there's a little bit here, you suffer from success. I remember the 70s and early 80s, and there really was a sense that judges were just taking over the country and running it, huge chunks of it, and in incredibly reckless and destructive ways. And it wasn't just that it was offensive to serious legal scholars, the quality of the arguments that the justices were using. It was also that they were really just out of control. I think that seems to be less the case after the 20 years of you all doing your work and many good judges getting on the bench. But we may have unfortunately some more occasions to remind people of this over the next 3 years. And I do think the public as a whole is a little more open understands a little more clearly than perhaps they used to, or at least is open to the argument that no, you can't just have judges, being nice to who they think are the nicer, more deserving for some reason, plaintiffs or defendants in particular cases. I was struck by that in the Sotomayor debate. I mean, how little the public resistance to this, to mere fairness as opposed to obeying the law. But I think here also one has to, originalism is part of it, but also we the people is part of it. A lot of things are reserved to the people to decide. We can then debate whether it's the people at the state level, the people at the federal level. And I think it has to kind of it's important to mix a kind of populist critique of the court's overreaching with an originalist critique, if you will, of the court's overreaching to have, I think, real political potency. Yeah.
You mentioned that the kind of intellectual base of the conservative party, the conservative movement, is to a certain extent been somewhat dismissive of the Tea Party movement and that kind of popular uprising. But you also mentioned that popular uprising is really the only way, and the only way to win elections, the only way it's worth it to win elections. So I guess my question is, how can the conservative movement be successful in implementing and sustaining its agenda in the long term if the intellectual base of it, if the intellectual base generating the ideas is not compatible with and cannot bring itself to embrace the populist conservative base necessary to win elections?
Well, I think a lot of people can bring themselves to embrace is too strong, but to understand the importance. I mean, the genuine respect one should have for the public in a democracy. People really do have some understanding of their own interests, and I would say, generally speaking, here that intellectuals of all sorts, including libertarian and conservative ones, are a little too quick to say, well, that's just the public thinks that. But as I said before, we have a study that shows the opposite, and so our study must be right and they must be wrong. So generally, be a little more respectful of the public. Now, a lot of conservatives are. A lot of conservatives have written a lot of articles and books about why, and again, this is sort of a familiar kind of Hayekian argument argument. There are a million different versions of it. Why, the accumulated wisdom of crowds, so to speak, is often pretty impressive compared to, the fancier intellectual arguments of a few people. But I think that has to be an important part of conservatism. And then there have to be debates among conservative elites. I mean, I was just generally saying I think some conservative elites, maybe particularly in D.C., were a little too, they like controlling things. They like feeling that, what you write in your magazine is kind of setting the agenda, and that if we have a debate, at AEI between this person and that person, that's sort of the debate about the future. And then it turns out, well, that was a very nice debate, but meanwhile the future is being shaped out, in 30 different Senate races and in a whole bunch of populist uprisings against certain things. But that's American history, and the truth is that successful conservatism finds a way to meld the two. I mean, I was not active really, but I was in grad school in the late 70s. We write the history differently now, and it's so Reagan was wonderful, and there was great popular support and great intellectual support, it all came together, but it didn't come together so neatly. Very few conservative economists in 1978 thought, let's have a property tax rebellion in California and then Massachusetts, and let's put constitutional limits on that tax. It's not, from a strictly economic point of view, probably the right tax to limit or cut in that way. And then supply side economics, of course, was extremely controversial among conservative economists in 79, 80. And, it ended up, I think, by sort of respecting the public, what the public was most upset about, and also steering that upsetness in a way that made a little more sense economically in terms of cutting marginal tax rates. It all ended up, I think, producing pretty decent economic results for quite a while and actually helping the country. But the original revolt was, in fact, a property tax revolt, and one couldn't just sort of dismiss that. So that's a stupid revolt. We have the sensible version of it over here. And I think the same is true in lots of these areas. So I have no formula for this. I think conservatives, like all elites, conservative elites, like all elites, probably get a little inbred and need to sort of be more open to learning from what's happening out around the country. So we had about one person, literally one lawyer at the general counsel's office in education, and one bureaucrat who was friendly to this somewhere in the department, who was who were helping the homeschoolers around the country. And I think it was important. And we worked a little with the Justice Department under Attorney General Meese, and we're able to help a little bit to beat back some of the efforts of the teacher unions at the state level. And homeschooling continued to take off, totally bottom up. No one in Washington was planning the rise of the homeschool movement. Now, 25 years later, if I look back at my time in education as Bill's chief of staff, I would say that actually the two people we devoted to helping homeschooling, objectively, probably had more impact than the 200 people we had working on intellectual arguments for school choice and experimental voucher programs and all that. And I think it's a good example of just these things are very hard to predict. No one, no one would have said in 1980 there are going to be 1 million kids getting homeschooled, graduating each year in the U.S., and from some versions of homeschooling. It just seemed ludicrous. That was something that happened in 1820 or something, and there was, Gene Meyer knows a lot about this. There were like 3 oddballs in upstate New York who did it, and that was it. And the idea that this could become a serious thing, and then it could have complicated permutations where people would and now it's, of course, people come in and out of homeschooling in the public schools and the private schools. So it's interesting, and I think we were philosophically consistent. We were for greater choice and greater families having greater ability to control their kids' education, and that was consistent with both pushing choice programs and defending homeschooling. So I think, on the one hand, you have to stick to your principles and advance, but it's hard to know ahead of time which policy consequence of your principles is going to end up being the most potent or have the most political traction. And so I think that's what I mean. People need to have principles, but within those principles and in advancing those principles, one shouldn't be too dogmatic ahead of time about which will turn out to be most effective. And I think that's true in a lot of different areas of public policy. One last question, in the back there. Okay, not that far back. No one? My eyes aren't good. One last. Okay. Thanks a lot.